Hey guys, hope you're all doing well, and since there is so much hype around the RTX 30 series right now, and everyone's kind of planning their own upgrades for their system, or maybe a new system altogether, I thought I'd share some of my own upgrades that I'm making to my system today. So here we have a monoblock, some new EK torque compression fittings, and finally the proper sized radiator that is going into my system. As some of you might remember, when I first built this system back here, the radiator that I initially used was a little bit too thick, and that kind of caused the top panel to bow a little bit, and that was definitely less than ideal. And I also want to discuss my plans for the upcoming RTX 3090, which is going to be an absolute monster GPU, but I do plan on testing it in this tiny little system back here first, and that's something that I do want to discuss with you guys as well. So definitely a bit more of a laid back video today, kind of just going over some personal rig upgrades. I'll also be test fitting a couple things in this rig because the new water blocks are a little bit smaller. So yeah, let's roll the intro, take a look, and let's get into it. So here it is, my own PC that I use for gaming, 3D rendering, video editing, and all of the production side stuff that happens on the channel is done on this PC right here. Most of you are probably familiar with this PC. The last update was around 2 months ago, but for those of you who are new to the channel and don't exactly know what you're looking at here, I will give you a quick brief rundown. So the case is called the Formed T1. Doesn't usually look like this. All of the panels are of course taken off. I'll leave a link down below to where you can buy it and how you can buy it. They are in quite high demand at the moment, but it is an extremely good case, one of my favorite ever. The CPU that I've got in there is the Intel i9-9900KS. It's an 8-core processor that boosts up to around 5 GHz. I'll mention why that is still the kind of CPU of choice for this rig in a little bit. That's plugged into the Asus Strix Z390i motherboard, along with 32 GB of 3200 MHz memory. And then for the GPU, we have the RTX 2080 Ti. So the main reason that I'm so excited to upgrade this system from the RTX 2080 Ti to the RTX 3090 is because my use cases for this system, video editing, gaming, and 3D rendering, are all GPU bound. That means that I don't really see any performance gain from upgrading the CPU for this system compared to upgrading the GPU. The camera that I'm using right now is the Blackmagic 6K Pocket Cinema camera, so working with 6K footage, and there have been some instances where the RTX 2080 Ti just hasn't been enough to edit on a 4K timeline in DaVinci Resolve Studio, which is kind of hard to think about. Like, how is the top end gaming GPU not enough to edit 6K footage? But in some cases, the 11 GB of VRAM has been a serious bottleneck and has forced me to reduce the timeline resolution to something like 1080p. And then for those of you who have seen the last 2 videos on the channel, you'll know that they involved quite a lot of 3D rendering done in Blender. Of course, I don't have the RTX 3080 or 3090 in hand at the moment, so I still wanted to show some interesting kind of footage and animations, and Blender is something that allows me to do that. However, again, it is extremely GPU intensive. I personally prefer to render with the GPU in Blender. I find it a lot faster and more efficient. Moving forward, I'm not sure how much Blender I'll actually use in future videos because it's only really useful when you don't have the product in hand and you want to kind of explain something using animations. However, although I am super excited to upgrade to the RTX 3090 and speed up my own production workflow, I really doubt I can do it within the constraints and volume of this case. When running the 2080 Ti at stock, it'll settle to around 70 degrees C with a fairly low fan speed of around 1200 RPM. I'm able to get that down to around 60 to 58 C by undervolting the GPU and reducing the total power from 260 watts to 200 watts. I've done a video explaining how to do this previously, and I will leave that linked down below. But coming back to my initial point, the RTX 2080 Ti here in this kind of configuration in its stock form, pulling 260 watts, is definitely the limit of this custom loop with a 240mm radiator. I don't think I'd be able to push the power any much further than that. However, the RTX 3090 doesn't pull 260 watts, it supposedly pulls 350 watts, so I guess that kind of illustrates my doubts for this system moving forward. Alright, so there it is, a complete teardown of my build done in less than 10 minutes, which is always a surprisingly quick and easy thing to do for an RTX build because the parts are always so small and easy to work with. But now let's talk about the few upgrades that will be going into the system. Firstly, we have the radiator. Now, this build has been well overdue for a radiator swap. As some of you might remember, when I first built this system around 6 months ago, the radiator that I used was a few millimeters too thick. This meant that the top panel was actually bowing a little, which was less than ideal. The radiator that I was using previously was the 240mm AlphaCool ST30, and I'll be swapping that for the 240mm SE Classic from EK, which comes in at 27mm thick. That's this radiator right here, and paired with a couple of slim fans from Noctua, that means that we shouldn't get any bowing or top panel flexing like we had before. Then we have the monoblock, which I've already installed onto the motherboard, and that was pretty straightforward. And I will note that this is mostly a visual upgrade for the system. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with what a monoblock is, but for those who aren't, this is basically a CPU water block that additionally cools the VRM on your motherboard. That's the circuitry that's responsible for the power delivery to the CPU. The VRM on this build is far from overheating. It's not causing me any problems at all, but I am interested to see what the thermal improvement will be. Mostly, I think that we can all just agree that a monoblock looks far better than a regular CPU water block, and since there is one made for this board, which is actually pretty rare, I thought why not. And then lastly, I'll be replacing the handful of compression fittings in this build with the torque fittings from EK, which I recently used in the Cooler Master NR200 custom loop. And so now the build is complete with a fresh set of new fittings, the right sized radiator, and a new monoblock which looks absolutely sick. But little did I know that the next several hours would be spent troubleshooting the significantly warmer CPU thermals. In fact, when I first launched Blender, just to do a quick thermal check, the CPU immediately spiked to 86 degrees C. Now when CPU thermals spike like that immediately, I knew at this point it was most likely a mounting issue with the monoblock, so after a few remounting attempts and making sure that the thermal pads weren't preventing a solid mount, I was able to get the thermals down into a safe range, but this was still around 10 degrees warmer than before. Eventually, after significantly more time troubleshooting, I eventually just swapped back to the original AlphaCool water block that I had in there before, and that immediately saw CPU thermals return back to normal. So ultimately, a big thumbs down for this monoblock. I have no idea why CPU thermals were so much warmer. I mean, I didn't even have to run a long thermal test to kind of see a difference. I noticed the difference as soon as I booted up Blender and just kind of ran a normal stress test. Also, a quick note, before I actually rebuilt the system, I wanted to see if a larger DDC pump would fit alongside the new RTX 3090 water blocks from EK in this specific case. Those new water blocks are just 230mm long, which means I regained quite a bit more room in this build, and it turns out that yes, a DDC pump will comfortably fit in here. You'll just need to improvise your own mounting. The pump that I've got powering the system at the moment is the DC-LT 2600 from AlphaCool, which has been absolutely awesome. Powers this loop no problem at all despite how small it is, and it's pretty much the sole reason that I'm able to build a custom loop this compact. Important note though, when I first installed this pump, it was literally silent. You really couldn't hear it at all, but over time it has developed a very quiet noise. Still very quiet, but at least it is now audible, just something I thought I'd note. If this build does see an RTX 2090 upgrade with one of those compact water blocks from EK, then I'll likely upgrade to a larger pump as well. So it's a big shame that the monoblock didn't work out for this build. I was kind of really mainly excited to get this installed today because it is such a nicer looking block than really any CPU water block in my opinion. But oh well, sometimes things just turn out that way, and it is at least nice to get the proper sized radiator finally installed into this system. So as always, a huge thanks for watching. Make sure you're subscribed if you haven't already for the upcoming RTX 30 series content just around the corner, and I'll see you all in the next one.